The following is a local resident producer's program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of Oshkosh Media, the City of Oshkosh, or Time Warner Cable.
Everybody, welcome to another episode of On Oshkosh. I'm your host, Cheryl Hentz, and we're here with Gordon Hintz tonight. Gordon is our state assemblyman from the 54th Assembly District, and that covers all of Oshkosh and a little bit of an outlying area, right?
It's actually just the City of Oshkosh, and in fact, it doesn't have the north part between, I believe, Harrison and like Grove Street.
Oh, that's
on
someone
the north
different
side,
too.
and then
Okay.
north of Smith. So Mike
Okay.
Schraw has the top part of Oshkosh,
Okay.
and then Algoma down and around. So.
And Mike is the 53rd?
53rd.
Okay, all right. Okay, good. Well, the other thing is congratulations are in order since the last time you've been here. You are a proud papa for the second time. Let's see, Gethin, do you pronounce the X? Or
No, Xavier.
Okay, Gethin Xavier, 8.5 pounds, and born on Tuesday, May 21st, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So he's 8 weeks. He's already 2 feet long. We're both thrilled and exhausted, but yeah, it's an exciting time and trying to enjoy it as much as possible.
Absolutely, because they grow up fast.
They do. Long days, fast years, and I never understood that until right now.
Now you know the full meaning. Well, congratulations to all of you. And that includes big sister Beatrix,
That's right.
who you said is just over 2 years old?
2 years, 3 months.
Okay.
She's getting into a new terrain, as we like to say. But, she's into her brother, and I think they'll become good playmates, hopefully.
There you go. I know I was with my brother, and there was only like 3.5 years difference there, so hopefully it'll be the same with yours. So we're going to talk about a lot of stuff tonight. We did get some questions from some viewers. I put it out on Facebook that you were going to be here, and so I got some questions from some viewers and people on Facebook and so forth. So we'll get to those a little bit later on, but wanted to talk about school funding, I guess, first of all, mainly because you just wrote a piece earlier this week on, and you called it Republican Economics, More Money for Millionaires, Less for Schools. So tell viewers and listeners, because this may end up being on the radio too, the gist of your story, talking about Republican economics.
Yeah, so the Shepherd Express, which is a Milwaukee weekly, had asked for, an update or focus on some of the tax policy over the last few years. And every time you're discussing the budget overall, you have to look at, how are we managing the resources that we have available and what has been a priority. And schools are a priority for many people in Wisconsin. They know that education is one of the best investments that we can make in our future, important to communities, parents, grandparents, and the reality is every time we say governor proposes a budget, Republicans say, well, we don't have the means to be able to pay for that. You have to look at, do we have the means because we don't have the means, or do we have the means because we have made past decisions that reduced our ability to do that? And again, I think tax policy can be used as a stimulus to encourage consumer spending or decrease costs when targeted. It can be effective, but some of the past tax decisions have given away money disproportionately to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars that we don't have available right now. So I was highlighting the fact that we say we don't have the means to fund our schools at the level that would be necessary, but we did have the means to give people that earn over $20 million a year a significant tax break. And I think, you got to highlight, are you good stewards of the economy? And, if you don't have the means, why you don't have the means.
Yeah. And have you heard anything back from anyone who's read the article?
Well, I mean, this is a discussion that, having served on the budget committee, the previous two budgets, that we've certainly, highlighted when, again, I don't think we have the money to do everything, but if schools really are a priority and you say it's a priority, you've got to have the dollars there that actually are going to make the kind of impact and investment that you need to. And so this back and forth has been going on for a while. Part of my problem with this specific tax credit was that it was supposed to cost $128 million a year. Now it costs more than $350 million. And
So
again, the benefit has been disproportionate, and the economic impact has not, that's not exactly like we're lighting it up in this area.
Right. Well, I want to use that note to move into higher education. Tuition costs, rising costs of living, stagnating hourly wages, they're all making student debt the real only option that I think a lot of people have to go to college is to take on student debt, tuition and what have you. And yet, even when they're graduating, students are having a tough time repaying that debt. Now, there have been, first of all, State Treasurer Godlowski is partnering with the Department of Financial Institutions and the Higher Educational Aids Board to explore an issue of student debt here in Wisconsin. I'm not really sure what kind of a solution they're hoping to find. Are you aware of what they're hoping to find?
Well, I did meet with the state treasurer the other day, and she kind of said that it looks like they're going to be trying to develop a task force. This is one of those issues where I think people may not even realize how big a problem it really is. Student loan debt surpassed credit card debt as the, I think, number one debt, and Wisconsin is one of the higher states in terms of the debt load, and it's not just younger people. There are people still stuck with student loans that are in their 40s and 50s. Paying off things, and as this, state support and taxpayer support has moved away, the cost of a higher education has just grown exponentially. And even with the tuition freeze, the reality is, for the last 25, 30 years, students have been assuming this, cost and debt, and of course, with interest rates that are higher than they probably need to be. And what we're seeing is the normal age that people buy homes is being delayed. They're spending money on high-cost interest instead of being able to make those investments. They may be taking jobs that pay a little better instead of something that was in their career field, simply because they have this added cost. And it's really suffocating our economy. And so even folks that say, well, they're the ones who took it out, they should be responsible, or they went to college to get the benefit and they should pay for it. All of us are impacted when so many people in the economy are saddled with this debt, and if they're unable to pay for housing, other things that we've traditionally seen young people pursue at that age, they're certainly not going to have money for retirement and other things.
Right.
And of course, post-recession, the job environment from a wage standpoint simply hasn't been the same as it had been previously. The college education still is of value in terms of the jobs that are being added, but I think they're also not seeing the wages perhaps that we saw when you consider inflation of 20 years ago.
Well, and I think you made a good point that, if they can't afford to pay back their student debt, it's not like it doesn't affect us. It affects all of us. It's just like people who don't have insurance, that affects all of us as well. And so I always kind of chuckle when I hear people say, well, it's incumbent upon them. It was their debt. They need to pay it. You can't just have that sort of supreme being attitude about things.
No, and I think that is the hard part, because it's natural to kind of have that default, well, they should have known better when they took it out, but it impacts all of us.
Circumstances change, though.
Took all of us in, everybody's impacted in the economy. And of course, when we get to solutions, There's been options on the table for years to allow the state to help students refinance that debt. So just like you would a car or a home, just given what some of the rates are. And I think they're really going to look at those kind of options, partner with some national organizations, because as a state, we should be doing whatever we can. I think some of the proposals you're hearing at the federal level are probably a little unrealistic, related to, forgiving, all of this debt. I mean, I think people take on thinking they're going to be in a position to pay it back, but when you're 28 and you're working and you say, am I ever going to get ahead, and you've got $40,000-$50,000 of debt and you're paying a couple hundred a month, it's hard to think you're ever going to get there. And I think that's the overwhelming feeling, and it's something that when you look at what the tuition costs were at a place like Oshkosh in the early 70s, it was like $100.
Yeah.
And it's just as we've cut back, and that cost has been assumed by a lot of folks.
Yeah. You mentioned at the federal level, we've got some Democratic presidential candidates right now who are sort of floating an idea of free education in this country. And certainly there are some other countries that do offer free education for its residents. Do you think that we could, as a country, move into something like that? I know it would be difficult to, forgive all the outstanding debt, but is it possible to move to a model where it's a free education thing? Or if we can't do it as a country, is that something Wisconsin could do? And before you answer that, I will say this. I mean, sure, you're going to have a lot of people then moving to Wisconsin to take advantage of that.
Many people.
Yeah, maybe put some caveat at the beginning of it that you've got to be a resident here for X number of years. And a caveat perhaps at the end that says because when people get a college education here, you want to retain them in your own state. So maybe put something at the end that says, okay, you've gotten your free education.
Stay here for 5
now
years,
you have
10
to stay
years.
here for X number of years. I mean, do you see anything like that working?
I mean, first of all, the federal government is spending an exorbitant amount of money and not raising enough revenue to pay for it. In other words, the last tax cut and the increase in defense spending and Medicare and other things is, there's just it'd be hard to imagine them until they balance their budget, taking on that sort of thing. And there are questions about whether that's appropriate. I think President Obama talked about perhaps starting with making the first 2 years of community college free, which would appeal to folks that are living at home that might be at the most difficult means. I think states like Tennessee had a program like that, and so I think both either at the state or federal level, that might be something that we want to make it easier, because I think for a lot of folks, you don't want financial obstacles to be the reason that they're not pursuing it in the first place. And I think there probably is a lot of caution, and we've done a lot of financial literacy efforts to make sure people that are going to school don't end up with tremendous debt, that we can get them out in 4 years. Our 2-year schools still serve as a really cost-effective option to get your first 2 years done. So maybe building off of that model is a more realistic way to look at things. But we want an educated society. Employers want educated workers, and we know that's going to be increasing, again, what the demand is for. So, there's a good discussion to be had, but I think we have to right-size it.
Sure. I want to move on to redistricting and gerrymandering. This is something that every 10 years the census is done, and then from that, lawmakers such as yourself, they redistrict, they redraw the voting lines and so forth. And in past years, with the Republicans in control of both the House and the Senate, or the Assembly, the lines just haven't been drawn very fairly. And they've been drawn in such a way to almost ensure that Republicans are going to keep getting reelected in those certain gerrymandered areas. I know there's been a lawsuit about it. The League of Women Voters filed a lawsuit, I believe, on that and lost. Now we've got an upcoming census, and Trump wants to, play games with some of the questions. So, I mean, A, do you see the census actually getting done in time with him kind of playing some games here? And B, once that's done, is there a way possibly that now the Democrats are at least in some control, that these lines can be redrawn fairly?
Yeah, I mean, look, including Winnebago County, I forget how many counties in the state have passed resolutions overwhelmingly by the voters to support fair maps. And this is something that I thought, well, it's process, people aren't paying attention to it. But the reality is, with data, with mapping, you can do really pretty predictive ways to figure out where the votes are going to come from. Our maps in Wisconsin are skewed, so there are really 64 Republican districts and 35 Democratic districts. The numbers are pretty close to that and how it plays out, 64 and 36. 36 and 63, sorry. And the outcomes have been, in the last maps that we had, in the worst Democratic year in 50 years, Assembly Democrats ended up with 39 seats. Well, 2018 was the best Democratic year in 50 years, and we ended up with 36 seats. And so, it's a complicated system of packing and cracking. You take a 60% seat and make it an 80% seat to try to minimize the number of Democratic seats.
Yeah.
And then you cut up places like Milwaukee like a pie to have slivers to sort of dilute the impact of more Democratic-leaning seats. I think everybody understands trying to, what the electoral outcome is. I think what people really need to understand, and we're starting to get more traction on this, is democracy only works if you have to face the voters every 2 years and be accountable for your decisions. And if there's no chance you're going to lose the election, then there's no reason to be accountable. When I talked to some of my colleagues during the lame duck session where they were taking away the governor's power before he was sworn in, I said, what are you guys doing? And they're like, I don't want to vote for this, but, the only way they would lose their seat is in a primary from someone who's more extreme, right? The same thing I had on finance. I'd say, you don't support this. And they'd be like, yeah, but I got to pick and choose my battles. And so why don't we do Medicaid expansion, even though it's supported by 70% of the public? It's because they're insulated from having to face voters who may actually want that. So everything you hate about politics, everything the public, why don't their priorities reflect what we need, is largely because of a system that maintains advantage that makes them unaccountable to the voters. Now, we do have a new census, and with divided government, with a Democratic governor and Republican legislature, it won't be for 2020, but during the 21-22 session, they will be required to draw new maps. If they can't agree, it will go to the courts, and then those maps are drawn. I think that's what we've done the last few decades. So those end up being more fair. But the reality is, and since I've been in office, I was a supporter of this when Democrats were in charge too. States like Iowa have had for decades, an independent redistricting process that sets certain rules, leaves it to a commission to, sort of draw districts contiguous with other boundary lines and do so in a way to try to be as fair as possible. There's always going to be urban-rural, divides, places that are more conservative than others, but politicians shouldn't be picking their voters, and it's only going to be easier with all the data and privacy issues that are out there. We shouldn't have politicians pick their voters. It should be the other way around. And I think people of all stripes, feel this way, but it is impacting, 37 states have taken Medicaid. We waste $324 million a year as a result, or over the budget. And so it's, I think people are starting to get it, and we should be proactive about passing a policy that would take it out of our hands.
So you've mentioned Medicaid expansion. Let's jump to that one. I had a couple other questions before that, but that's fine. We can jump to this one first. We haven't, as you just said, taken any kind of money for Medicaid in this state. Governor Walker just sort of, I won't use the word I'm thinking of, he just sort of let it go to someone else and let it fall by the wayside. Do you see Governor Evers, jumping on board here and taking some money and getting some Medicaid expansion?
Well, I wish. And before, Wisconsin Republicans changed the law, it used to be that the governor could have just accepted the money. Governor Walker didn't. But again, this is part of the Affordable Care Act. The federal government wanted to make it as easy as possible for states to expand coverage for the population that is most difficult to insure, those that make under $17,000 or $18,000 a year. And so they said, hey, we'll pay 80% or 90% of that group of childless adults that you need to expand coverage for, between under 133% poverty. And other states have taken it. Mike Pence did it in Indiana. Republicans in Michigan and Iowa did it. They did it their own way, but not only did it provide affordable health care coverage, made sure that people that went to the hospital had insurance in the first place, but they also did it because it saved taxpayer money. The money that we now spend on covering people could be spent on schools or universities or other things. We have given up more than a couple $1 billion, I think, or at least 1 point something billion since 2014 by not taking it. And so we could take the money, and then Governor Evers proposed taking it and putting the money into saving into our healthcare system to expand some coverage for behavioral care, for rural medicine, for healthy babies, because we still have a higher infant mortality rate than some other states. And it would have been able to draw down more federal money, which would have helped with that. It doesn't make any sense from a moral standpoint or a financial standpoint.
Well, that's what I was just going to say. All these different things that we're talking about here, Gordon, it infuriates me, first of all, and I think it does. I'm not unique. I think a lot of people are upset about this, and just the way Republicans continue to do business as if it's business as usual, and then we look at our next door neighbor, Minnesota, where they do everything so much differently and they are so much further ahead. Do we have a lot of lawmakers, and I say this half in jest and yet half seriously, do we have a lot of lawmakers in Madison who are just plain stupid? I mean, why can't they see the writing on the wall here? That if you do some of these other things, you're going to be better off in the long run. Why don't they see it?
I think it may be short-sighted in terms of looking at what the overall impact of the state is, and I still feel like if the majority of my colleagues had the opportunity to take the Medicaid funding, they would. I think it's more of a leadership decision which has become so overly political that even though Governor Walker may have been the obstacle, he was running for president, he didn't want to take Obamacare, it's government insurance, these guys seem to say, well, if we pass this, Governor Evers will get a win, a political win. Even though Republicans all over the country, we're one of 13 states, we're in the minority, and we're actually paying more to cover fewer people. And so, individually, again, I've had some conversations where, they were hesitant, but there's ways that they could put their conservative prints on this. I mean, in Indiana, they expanded Medicaid, but they did health savings accounts, which I wouldn't be thrilled with, but advocates there said, you know what, it's better than not doing it. So, I mean, there are ways they could have done things that I think were consistent with, their market ideology while saving the taxpayers money and getting a win out of it that wouldn't be, perceived as Tony Evers getting what he wants.
Well, see, there's the problem, too.
Oh, the political thing is...
Yeah, I mean, when you've got... I will forever hate the two-party system or any party system. I just, people are so worried about what their colleagues on their side of the aisle are doing, and we can't give the other side of the aisle any win, just like what you were saying. And I think it's the same, it starts at the top. We've got a man sitting in the White House who seems to be hell-bent on tearing down anything that Barack Obama did. And that's the wrong way to govern. And this is just more of the same here.
Absolutely. And again, I will go back to the redistricting in that, if you aren't held accountable by the voters, and again, by doing redistricting this way, you create more seats on the way left and you create more seats on the way right. I've got Democratic colleagues that would lose their seat in a primary, and that would be the only way they could lose their seat. There's only a handful of seats that really could be competitive within single digits, and again, that makes our politics more extreme. And remember, it's not just Wisconsin. We may have had the most extreme redistricting, but a number of other states have had the same thing. I mean, 85% of Americans support universal background checks to stop violent criminals from being able to buy firearms from gun shows that don't do the checks. But when they've interviewed some of these conservative, Republicans, they say, well, I can't support that because I would lose my seat in a primary to some gun, nut who, maybe, that the most fervent part of the low turnout primary would be people, that 15%. And so it really stops us from doing some things because of how much it distorts our accountability that's supposed to be part of a democracy.
But on the other hand, okay, so they feel that they might lose some support from single-issue voters. They also might gain some support from other single-issue voters, for certain things. So that's not really a logical approach.
It shouldn't be, but the one thing on a lot of these single issues is the intensity. So even if you ask people, the majority of people might feel one way, but it might not be their biggest issue. To single-issue voters, that's their biggest issue, and it's the intensity of it is what makes it disproportionate.
That's why we have some people who run for office, whether it's local office or a higher office such as your own. They're one-issue candidates, and they're going to appeal to one-issue voters too. So I hear what you're saying. Not happy about it.
You're not alone.
Okay, let's talk about Foxconn. That's something else that just is a thorn in my side, and I think a lot of other people. How long has it been since we actually passed this deal to bring Foxconn into this state?
So it was the end of July 2017 that we had the announcement and the fanfare, and then the debate, and then I think the legislation was early September, and the contract was signed in November of 2017. And since then, the information has been scarce. We don't know exactly what's happening, other than a lot of earth has moved. There's something happening there, but the projections have been scaled back considerably. We have more than, I think, $140 million that's been taken away from other highway projects to go into local infrastructure there, specifically for Foxconn. But the last thing that we heard was, well, we're going to open something next May, and when it's fully operational, there'll be about 1,500 employees. But what they will be doing, what they will be producing,
how much they'll be making?
How much they'll be making. I mean, some would say, well, that means they're not going to get a lot of that money. And that's true, meaning that would fall short of what the credits would be to get the cash payments. But the capital investment, if they build an automated factory, 1,500 might be enough to get some of the credits for that. And so I think, wait and see. But the one thing, and I think we talked about it before the show, is the transparency and the communication, if you're taking taxpayer money, is something that I think the public expects. And if the project needed to change for economic reasons that could be justified, I think, okay, there might be some understanding. But we've had none of that, and I think that's the frustrating part. I mean, look, if it's going to happen, I want it to be the most successful version, even if I don't think it was worth it. But right now, it's looking like a boondoggle.
Well, sure, and they haven't kept true to their word in any other case where they have been building their facilities in other states. They're just not, I just don't see them as trustworthy at all.
Well, I think it's about what the intent is. I mean, at the time that we were debating this, a lot of the economists that covered LCD market, the East Asian economy, said, it doesn't make sense, with 8 times the labor costs that China pays, for them to produce anything here unless their goal is to have favorable trade relations with the Trump administration and avoid tariffs, because we buy most of the products that Foxconn makes for Apple and others in China. So if their intent was to, do something here, but lose a little money slowly in order to keep their markets open, that doesn't benefit the state of Wisconsin. Remember, we didn't, under what they were originally going to do, the payback was 25 years. So I want to know, if we're spending state money, that there's going to be something viable 5, 10, 20 years from now. And we've seen the LCD market collapse. Prices have dropped 50%. And it just doesn't seem like they're going to be able to have a manufacturing facility. The question is, what are they going to have?
Yeah. Did you say, Gordon, where did you say that $140 million came from? Did you say the transportation budget?
So the State Highway Rehabilitation Fund, they took the money from there to pay for local roads for Foxconn. So, when you spread it out over 72 counties, that may not add up to that much, but the reality is, here we are, we can barely pay for roads right now, and even that amount being diverted, was money that we won't get back if the project folds. And so Obviously, there's a bigger cost to the state on the tax incentives if they were to ever happen, but I don't think we should say, oh, no big deal, 140 million. I mean, that still could have done a lot in our county.
Well, it certainly could. And so now I have to jump way ahead because we're on the subject of roads. Wisconsin has some of the worst roads in the country. Oshkosh has some of the worst roads that I've seen in many, many years. I want to know, we've got a few road questions here. Okay. First of all, I don't understand why the state puts roundabouts where they do. There is no lie, up in Appleton, there are a few different roundabouts. A couple of them are in upper scale neighborhoods, okay? So you've got beautiful homes that are probably, I don't know, $250,000 up to maybe $500,000 or $750,000 homes, which I don't think $250,000 is upscale necessarily, but these are the kinds of neighborhoods that you've got, and they're not traveled that much. These roads are not that busy, and yet I see roundabouts in them. I think that is a tremendous waste of money. Why do you need a roundabout or two in a neighborhood like that? So stupid spending there. And then I want to talk about Highway 41. Now, I don't even know what the question is, but I know what I want to say because I travel 41 a lot. There is a stretch of road, and I'm sure you've driven it too, between here and Neenah, and it's both on the southbound side of the highway and the northbound side, where it looks like they did all this new stuff and then they left this patch
like blacktop.
Yes, of crap. Why is that?
It looked temporary, but it's been there long enough, right?
Right. Why didn't they do something with that? I mean, it not only does it look different and it looks like crap, but it rides differently too. What's the deal? Why, when you've got tens of millions of dollars that have been spent on this I-41 corridor and doing something with the 441 bridge and all of that, and then you've got these two sections, one on each side, that just look, I don't know, like crap?
Well, I think every time I've been on here, you've had a question on transportation that
and I always will until this state starts spending money smartly.
I agree that I think some of the roundabouts make a lot of sense. I think maybe we've gotten carried away, and I don't know if local government there decided to pursue some of these, but those are decisions made by somebody, and I think each community should get to decide a little bit if it makes sense. On the other things, I mean, this is part of a broader transportation problem because in addition to borrowing money and delaying projects and maybe doing a resurfacing instead of a reconstruction, they've had to skimp, right? You try to have to make more out of the limited dollars that you have. And so a lot of the decisions that have been made over the last 8 years were trying to be done on the cheap. And maybe, I don't know why that patch is, but I've noticed it, and I knew what you were talking about. Did they say, well, you know what, that's not that bad. It was temporary, but maybe we'll keep it for a while and fix it later. But it does stand out in what is actually a pretty gorgeous, especially with 441, safe, flows, accommodates traffic pretty well, stretch of highway that I think we're lucky to have done given the delays in other parts of the state. But, the reality is this budget, the governor proposed pretty bold, I don't know if I would go as far as he did, sustained funding with an increase in the gas tax that, would get us through going forward for a number of years. We didn't do that, but they did take some money out of the general fund, do some vehicle registration fees. So there is new money that I think for the next 2 years will fund a lot of things, but we'll be back in the same position in 2 years. The reality is we have a lot of need. We can have good roads or we can have gravel roads. You get what you pay for.
Sure. Well, is there someone that you can talk to? I mean, I realize that there are problems all over the state.
I'll get an answer to that one.
I know what you're talking about. But since this one is right in our neck of the woods, yeah, that would be nice if you could find out an answer. So here's a question from a viewer. This person says, I hit a pothole some time ago, $700 in damage. When are we going to raise gas tax 15 cents per gallon and fix the roads? This would cost me $150 per year, but according to the Society of Civil Engineers, repairing roads would save $225 in wear and tear on each person's car per year. So if you do the math on that, you're actually coming out ahead. And yet I know people don't want to hear about gasoline taxes. They don't want to hear about any taxes or any fees. But, you know, if this person's math and figures are correct, that seems like a no-brainer
Yeah, and most
too.
people would say, well, I don't plan on hitting a pothole. You know, so yeah, right.
You can't avoid
I know
them.
that but everybody gambles like that. I mean, the reality is, look, good infrastructure is also good for the economy. You know, when you're selling your
Yes.
community, or especially Northeast Wisconsin, we make things, right? If you look at, trucks take what we make in Northeast Wisconsin, and they need to get through Milwaukee efficiently. They got to get to Chicago, and they get to distribute it around the world. So when I talk to Schneider and when I talk to other companies, they said, we support the gas tax. We want good infrastructure. I think one of the things we're seeing, and it's playing out locally, is, well, how do we fix our local roads? Because the local road aids have declined. We know that we've squeezed, they've squeezed local government's ability to pay for things. How do we invest enough in our infrastructure, a lot of it which is outdated, to have a modern, safe, efficient economy that, I think that person is right, keeps them from having to spend $700 to fix their alignment or anything else. I mean, the reason the gas tax is still, I think, the best revenue, I don't know if I'd go that high again, is because the more you drive, the more you pay. By doing registration fee increases, my mom, who drives 500 miles a year, pays the same as I do, and I drive 30,000 miles. And of course, doing registration fee doesn't capture any gas paid for people from Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa that are driving through, which is like 12 to 15% of all the revenue.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about something that you certainly don't have any control over this one, but you are residents here in the city, so want to ask your opinion on this. The city is, as you know, is looking at instituting either a fee that will go on the water bills each month, and it will be used to help defer some of the costs of road reconstruction and repair. The Chamber of Commerce here does not support that idea. They would rather see something different. A wheel tax has also been floated in the city. I'm not exactly sure what the city is going to end up doing, but one way or the other, I think it's a foregone conclusion that we're going to have some kind of little assessment tacked on to our water bill, or there'll be a wheel tax, or something is going to go up. But one thing I will say about the Chamber, they felt that the first methodology, people wouldn't see, they wouldn't reap the results of that. But that's not really true, because I think that they would. I mean, as I understand it, this fee that the city wants to charge us would be to do roads, one road here, one road there. We all drive down different roads in the city, as you do in the state as well. So we'd all benefit one way or another, because we wouldn't be hitting potholes necessarily on, major roads or what have you. As a resident in the city, do you have a thought on this?
I follow this. I've had some discussions, and I think a lot of it speaks to the fact that, again, the constraints put on local government have put, municipalities in a position where, whether it's the event fees, or other things, they've increasingly had to try to squeeze and look for new ways to try to maintain infrastructure. I think there are a lot of folks that have long felt that the assessment policy is, overburdened on people. The fact that you live on the street but others drive on it, should that be, you be responsible for paying that additional assessment? And of course, the problem with transitioning to anything new is, well, if I have paid that assessment, you've got someone who, has to get their street done, but it'll be paid for by the whole city. Is that equitable and fair? I think what the conversation really needs is, there are pros and cons with each of these types of approach. And I'm sympathetic to some of the businesses that are saying, it disproportionately burdens us because of the, parking lots or rooftops or other things that would shift more of the overall burden based on how it's assessed to some of the businesses. So, I try not to meddle, because I know how tough some of these decisions are. I have had some conversations with a handful of council members about, well, is there anything that we can do? I know there's talks, because it's not just Oshkosh and it's not just Winnebago County, about looking at giving voter-approved referendum at the county level for a sales tax that could be used by each of the municipalities as they choose. I don't know that that's going to happen anytime soon, but I think these are the kinds of discussions we're having. In Wisconsin, our municipalities have fewer options available to them than communities in other states. And the reason is that because we used to have shared revenue, we wanted to have sort of equalization between property rich and property poor communities, but we're not really doing that anymore. And so the question is, well, the few tools available are sort of these assessments or trying to do something that is a little bit more affordable for someone. And so you're going to have winners and losers, and there are pros and cons. I'd like to see what the impact has been in Neenah, because I think, didn't they do something like this?
I think they talked about it, and I'm not sure if they actually did it. I'm not sure, so I can't say. But as far as the shared revenue goes, the state is still taking shared revenue, right? I mean, they're still taking it, but they're giving back less and less to the communities that they're taking it from. And that, too, isn't helping our situation. I mean, I think about, what we could do in this community alone if the state would give back some of the shared revenue like they have given back to us in the past. What percentage are they giving back now?
It has been, over the last 18 or 19 years, it has been flat or cut. There has not been an increase, and it is an increasingly smaller and smaller part of the overall city's budget. And then we've obviously put, there's been levy restraints that have limited communities' ability. Part of the problem, I think, with both, municipal support for state funding and the university's support is at the end of the day, my city services remain good. In other words, until there's blood on the streets, no one's going to pay attention to you. My streets get plowed, my garbage gets picked up, the police respond. I feel very good about those things. In other words, our City of Oshkosh has become incredibly efficient and effective at maintaining services, but they haven't been able to invest in streets or parks or economic development.
Right.
The kind of quality of life things that you see if you go visit. When I go to St. Paul and visit my brother, the parks there are absolutely gorgeous. It's like a modern world. Same with the university. There are dedicated professionals there that are teaching kids. They're getting a good education, but it doesn't fall apart overnight. But our declining investment in our communities and in our UW system is showing wear and tear and decline. And of course, while it doesn't fall apart overnight, you can't rebuild it overnight. And we'd be wise to recognize the benefit of investment in both.
Sure. I want to go back to one of these other questions here. And this is actually a question that I have. I meant to bring it up when we were talking about Medicaid expansion, but we moved on to something else. This is something now, this is one thing that I would agree with Donald Trump on. He had actually wanted to pass a new administration rule that would have required TV commercials to actually, the commercials for prescription drugs, to actually say what those drugs were going to cost the consumer. As you can imagine, that got shot down by Big Pharma. They don't want people to know the prices. Here you go with no transparency again. So that was shot down, in part because big pharma giants like Merck and Eli Lilly filed a lawsuit and got it stopped. So that's a loss for consumers as of right now. But now Tony Evers, he announced back in April that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, they have notified the Department of Health and Human Services that they have approved here in Wisconsin a 10-year extension for the senior care program. And for those who don't know, the senior care program is one in which it provides residents here in Wisconsin who are 65 years of age or older and who meet the eligibility criteria, with some pretty low co-payments on drugs, like $5 to $15. I guess that's a good that's a good thing for them. But is there anything similar to that can be done for people who are younger, under the age of 65, and are low income, low to moderate income, just having trouble paying their bills, much less paying for prescriptions?
Every day. I think that I read a story about someone who was splitting their pills related to their insulin intake on diabetes,
that's not helpful.
Who passed away as a result. And these stories are all too common. And the reality is there are other countries that have stronger regulation that don't have these kind of, exorbitant costs. On your advertising thing, I believe I read that both New Zealand and the United States are the only countries that allow for television advertising of pharmaceuticals. And of course, that alone, that decision is different than than other countries, and it has an impact. But the reality is there's a ton of money to be made. We're already seeing class action lawsuits related to the opioid epidemic because there are consequences of big pushes on these things. But I'm recognizing that the revenue for R&D allows for some innovation in these things. But the reality is if these are things that people count on to live, which we do, and that we pay so much more for the same drug that is affordable in a place like Canada, there has to be a better way to do this. And there's too many stories of this negatively impacting, even causing death in these cases. At a state level, it gets complicated. We can join other lawsuits on those things, but it really requires some conviction by our lawmakers in Washington to take on, big pharma.
Sure. And, I don't know what more can be done since the Trump administration wanted this and it just went nowhere. I mean, I guess maybe there's going to be, like so many other things, lawsuits back and forth, until it just reaches the Supreme Court and then it's dead at some point. Wanted to give you another question here from a constituent and viewer. Would lawmakers in Wisconsin ever consider taking a sales tax holiday like other states do to help with back-to-school shopping for clothes and supplies? And then the person went on to say, to be honest, it would be for everybody, and it usually ranges from such items as computers to shoes to clothing and supplies, etc. Other states that have tax holidays usually do 2 or 3 days in August. An example of some states that take a sales tax holiday are Arkansas, Iowa, Missouri, New Mexico, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Virginia. Sounds like a reasonable idea.
We have had this debate, and I forget what took place in the last budget when it was proposed, but the reality is that, from an economic stimulus standpoint, it just sort of concentrates spending. It doesn't necessarily generate any more spending. There isn't, an impact financially to the state because people are certainly going to take advantage of it. I think the question is that the best kind of, tax cut to provide? I think when they proposed them, and I understand they're just saying for every good, I think in the past it had been targeted towards school-related supplies. I think these things have been introduced in the past. I think I'll look at Arkansas and some other states. It ends up being real money if it's a big purchase, but.
Well, sure, but even though it's not necessarily generating more money from the state, it's I think an act of goodwill, if you will. It's letting taxpayers know that, hey, we do care a little bit about you, even though we're wasting your money every other day of the year. We'll give you these 2 or 3 days here, where we'll give you a little bit of a break on certain items. It infuriates me when lawmakers that are opposed to all these things, they're so concerned about not their constituents. They're concerned about their fellow lawmakers and how they should vote. And they don't give a damn, it seems, about the constituents who actually are putting them in office, So I don't know. It does not make any sense to me.
I think on the redistricting, I'll bring up again, if you don't have the accountability that is there in a democracy, I mean, on issues that I think are complicated, that I usually reach out and talk to enough people because I don't get to choose exactly how I think things should be.
Right.
And that's part of the balance you need to have as a lawmaker.
So, real quick question here. What are your future political aspirations, if you have any? Will you be running again in 2020? And if so, as a Democrat in this particular seat, or something higher?
So obviously, I would say the last few years it's been a every 2-year decision. and I'll have to make that decision over the next year. I think having a family changes, your things. It's harder for me to want to be away. The harder I work, I don't, get paid anymore. That being said, I find it very fulfilling. I'm very into the work that I do. I always say if you don't get excited to go into the Capitol, that's when you'll know it's time to leave. I'm still excited, but I have to do an assessment about what's right for me. I don't know what my initial thoughts were. I don't need to be in Congress or run for president or anything. I mean, I like serving Oshkosh. I'm not saying that I wouldn't consider other things, but I also think there are ways to serve the public outside of public service and make a difference. And I'm not fearful of what's on the other side, but I'll make the best decision that I can for my family and for me, over the next year.
Okay, excellent. On the subject of roads, going back to roads now, I want to talk about some of the people who are driving on our roads, and those would be drunk drivers. Wisconsin does not have a good history at all when it comes to punishing drunk drivers and holding them accountable for what they've done, whether they've injured someone, whether they've killed someone, whether they've, seriously maimed someone. We give people 1, 2, 3 cracks at it before we really start to buckle down and say, okay, now you're going to pay for what you've done. Why are we not serious about drunk driving? And when are we going to become more serious about it, where we start punishing right at the very first offense?
Well, I think we have become more serious in my time in the legislature.
Not enough,
we
though.
have cracked down. You're right. I mean, as long as we're the only state, I think, in the country that doesn't have first offense as a criminal charge, we'll be an outlier. Anytime you have the kind of staggering numbers we do have with reoffenses, anytime you read about 8th, 9th, 10th offense, we've done some things here locally that I think we should be proud of related to diversion programs, trying to break the cycle. If you're an alcoholic and you need to drive, until you fix the alcoholism problem, you're not going to be able to stop the driving program. Actually, earlier this year in the Assembly, we passed that if you get a first offense drunk driving, you have a mandatory court appearance. I know that doesn't seem like a lot, but too many people would be able to evade actually having to make that appearance.
They just pay the ticket and be done with it.
We also passed a bill that would, if drunk driving ended up in death, you had a minimum of 5 years you had to serve, which seems,
Doesn't seem like a lot, but
doesn't seem like a lot, but again, because of the
stuff.
different situations, it was a stiffening of the penalties, trying to have some accountability. But I think you are seeing, our county health department has done a great job, especially with younger people, at trying to change the culture around tobacco, alcohol, drinking, and responsibility. And having grown up here, we do know it. A younger version of me, sort of celebrated, Packer games and maybe having, an extra beer or two. We have to recognize that there has to be more responsibility with that, and I'm hopeful. We have a proactive tavern league here that has a safe rides program that I think has resulted in fewer drunk driving locally, and efforts like that are a good part of the solution as well.
Okay, very good. And one thing we talked about before we went on the air was sex offenders and, where they go to live, why some people are getting upset when they're moving into their neighborhood, and the reasons why they should want to know where these people are going. You had been, I think, approached by somebody who was having a sex offender move into their neighborhood. Right?
Yeah, and so, this issue comes up whenever we have a case and a reaction, and these are complicated issues that involve sort of the balance between public safety and the constitutional rights of someone who's completed their sentence. And again, no two cases are the same, and we're not talking about the sexually violent. Right. Those are different issue which the county is dealing with, but the placement of people that are transitioning back. And we know the city has struggled with the fact that it's not equally distributed. A lot of the rental housing tends to be concentrated in the central city. The latest issue that I think we're dealing with is with a transitional placement housing, where it's sort of one house where people are in and out of that is causing some problems in the neighborhood. So we're working with the city, we're working with the Department of Corrections, to try to get some answers on, what that balance is and how we can be reassuring to people that we're addressing the issue in a way that makes them comfortable.
Sure. Well, and as I had mentioned to you when we were talking about this, knowing who is in your neighborhood, I think is always a smart idea. By the same token, I don't know that I would want someone living right next door to me who was a sex offender. But having said that, it would depend on exactly what kind of sex offender they were. Is it someone who is preying on small children, or is it someone who is maybe 18 or 19 years old and maybe has a 17-year-old girlfriend? There's different kinds of sex offenders. Now, the ones where where the police department has to do neighborhood notifications, those, of course, are more serious in nature, and I can understand. But I'd still want to know who the person is, as opposed to not knowing.
And it's the rational, it's the hard part between, as someone with 2 young kids and a daughter that's 2, balancing the rational with the emotional is challenging. I mean, I think something like 95% of all cases with sex offenders involve somebody that they knew, a family member, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a relationship that established.
What's the percentage?
I think it was 90 or 95 even.
Very high, though.
Very high. So in other words, it's not someone driving down the street and with the ultimate nightmare in a windowless van,
or
sweeping someone up. And so it is, knowing where people are, having police know where they are is one of the better things. But I'm very sympathetic to the fact that, if there's something that you don't like, if you're seeing a lot of traffic, if you're seeing behavior, if you don't feel like you're comfortable, I'm not going to tell someone, oh, don't worry about it. And so, I think we need to do everything possible. But I would agree with you that knowing who's there, why they're there, information is key, but also we need to have to make sure there's accountability.
Sure, absolutely. We've got about 2 minutes left here. Any closing thoughts that you want to share with us?
Just that, the one thing I've said in my time, and it's changed dramatically, is we still need engagement from the public during a time where politics is kind of a cynical sewer. And
that's a very polite way of putting it.
There are decisions being made, again, by state government, by local government, that have real impacts on people's lives. And I would just encourage people not to get cynical. I think it's harder than ever in some ways to pay attention to what's happening, but I still get good feedback. And there's a lot of things that government, I think, still has a positive role to play in. And so I'm always just, I have office hours, usually one Friday a month. I'm at the farmer's market, try to be once a month as well. And try to make myself available because I realize how important, that is. And on my level, look, it's just Oshkosh. I don't have this massive congressional district. You can still do people to people, trying to get out on some doors where I can go directly to talk to people. But I just want to remind everybody that maybe throwing their hands up and say it doesn't matter, that it does. And I think those of us in Madison really struggle with how do we get the information people need out there to even know what we're doing.
Sure.
And that's, I think, something that's been a challenge in our system.
Okay, very good. Well, Gordon, thank you for all that you do and have done and continue to do. And it's been too long, but we'll have you back on again soon, before the year is out.
And we'll have another transportation issue.
I'm sure that you will, because I'm going to stay on that.
I'm going to get you an answer. You can share it with everyone.
Until things get better. So anyway, thanks for being here. If you've got a few extra hours each month and you would like to do something fun and learn a lot, we're always looking for volunteers here at On Oshkosh. We've got a screen coming up here that will give you the information on how to get in touch with us. I'm not seeing that screen up yet, but hopefully there you go. There it is. There's my email address where you can contact us, and I can tell you more about it. So we provide training. It's about 4 hours a month, and if we could just put that screen back up one more time so that folks can get the email address in case they're trying to write it down, that would be fantastic. Anyway, that's going to do it for us here on On Oshkosh. We'll see you next time. Until then, take care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.